They didn't just kill him, they shattered him, piece by piece, soul by soul, in front of a cheering crowd. And they made sure you would never forget his screams. This was not justice. This was ritual, an offering, a violent prayer for control, whispered by fire and steel. And yet, you've never heard his name in your school books. Not like this. They erased Hugh Despenser not just from the throne, but from history itself. And when a name is erased this brutally, with entrails burned, limbs quartered, and the king's crown mocked with nettles, you have to ask, what secret was he protecting? Or worse, what truth was he becoming? We begin in a fog-covered England, 1326, a kingdom balancing on the edge of war and madness. The church's grip was tightening, the monarchy fractured, and beneath it all, something darker festered. A man once whispered into the king's ear with unchecked power. Not a general, not a prophet, but something far more dangerous, a favorite. A man who didn't command armies, but commanded desire, whose ambition infected the throne like rot from within, whose intimacy with King Edward II broke every rule England was built upon, politically, spiritually, and sexually. And when men like that rise, history doesn't just punish them, it butchers them. What you're about to hear is not a story. It's a descent into obsession, betrayal, psychological warfare, and the ancient machinery of societal cleansing. This is where image becomes ideology, where the enemy isn't a man, but the idea of a man who rose too close to power without permission. And if you listen closely, you'll start to see echoes. Echoes in modern governments, in your news, in the way scandals are weaponized, in the way desire, when it defies hierarchy, is still punished, not with fire anymore, but with exile, erasure, and spectacle. Because what they did to Hugh wasn't an execution. It was a message. Now listen carefully, because from here on, every word pulls you deeper. You're not watching a video. You're entering a forbidden chamber. And when we reach the end, you will not be the same man who began this journey. They say he was born noble, but nobility is a lie men tell themselves when they want power to look righteous. Hugh Despenser the Younger entered the world in the late 13th century with bloodlines soaked in influence. His father, a royal loyalist, his mother, the daughter of an earl. But this child wasn't raised on kindness. He was raised on expectation, the sharpened steel of ambition pointed inward, groomed not to serve the throne, but to become it. In those days, England wasn't ruled by strength alone. It was ruled by proximity. If you wanted true control, you didn't need an army. You needed the king's whisper. And Hugh learned early, it's not about command, it's about intimacy. He watched how men moved through court, like predators cloaked in silk. He learned how to speak without speaking, how to bend walls like branches in a storm. But most importantly, he learned the most dangerous lesson a man can ever absorb. That loyalty is just a mask worn by those who can't seize power for themselves. And then, fate gave him the perfect opportunity. King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, died. His son, Edward II, ascended, and he was nothing like his father. Sensitive, isolated, desperate for companionship, and above all, vulnerable. You see, Edward didn't trust warriors. He trusted favorites, men who made him feel seen, safe, worshipped. And that weakness was Hugh's invitation. He studied the fall of Edward's previous favorite, Piers Gaveston, a flamboyant, arrogant man whose grip on the king enraged the nobility. Gaveston was exiled, then hunted, then executed. But Hugh wasn't Gaveston. He didn't seek the spotlight. He sought the root. He made himself essential. Not loud, strategic, calculated. And slowly, he slipped inside the king's world. First as chamberlain, then as confidant, then something more. Whispers moved through the court like poison. The king and his favorite were more than friends. But in medieval England, that wasn't just scandal. It was heresy, treason, an offense not just to the crown, but to God. Still, Hugh rose, took land, took titles, married the king's niece, tightened his grip. The nobility began to murmur. Not, "Who is this man?" but "What is he becoming?" Power reveals, but absolute access, that corrupts reality. By 1320, Hugh Despenser wasn't just near the king. He was the king, in all but name. Edward II stopped making decisions without him. Parliament sessions were manipulated, noble claims ignored, and royal judgments bent until they snapped. Every whisper in the castle now funneled through Hugh's ears. He controlled the seals, the messages, the royal purse, and, increasingly, the will of the king. But power that flaunts itself breeds enemies. And Hugh wasn't subtle. He began seizing land from other nobles, not through war, but through something far darker. Legal manipulation, fabricated documents, forced transfers, trials with pre-written verdicts. Imagine your home, your title, your birthright, just taken and signed away by a man who smiled in the king's lap. And when people resisted, they vanished. The barons had endured leeches before, but Hugh wasn't just greedy, he was surgical. He didn't crush people, he unroped them. He had monks tortured for refusing false charters. Nobles accused of treason for merely speaking his name in frustration. Entire families were stripped of legacy and made ghosts in their own land. One account described his tactics like this: he ruled the realm through fear and flattery, and yet Edward adored him. Why? Because Hugh made him feel sovereign, not just as king, but as a man. Where others saw Edward's softness as weakness, Hugh saw it as leverage. The court began calling him the king's evil genius. And still, Hugh wanted more. He invaded the lands of his enemies under the pretense of law. He placed his own allies in every position of power. He even confiscated the inheritance of children, leaving noble orphans penniless, while his coffers swelled. England began to rot from within. The people hated him. The lords plotted against him. Even the queen, Isabella of France was stripped of her dignity, her lands confiscated, her sons taken and placed in the household of Hugh's wife. That wasn't politics. That was psychological warfare. You don't take a queen's sons unless you're sending a message. And Isabella received it. Loud, clear, unforgivable. It wasn't just that Hugh had overstepped. It was that he had humiliated the monarchy itself and still walked untouched. But the day was coming when blood would answer blood, and the fire would be lit. There's a moment in every tyranny when fear stops working, when humiliation hardens not into silence, but into resolve. For Queen Isabella, that moment came when her sons were taken. Understand this, in medieval Europe, a queen was often ornamental, symbolic, restrained by duty and diplomacy. But Isabella was born of French blood, raised at the core of a foreign court, trained to read faces like maps and use affection like a weapon. She had watched her husband wither under Hugh Despenser's control. She had endured the theft of her lands, the dismantling of her household, the hollowing of her marriage. But the removal of her children? That wasn't a power move. That was a declaration of war. In 1325, when Edward sent Isabella to France, under the guise of a diplomat in France, she met a man named Roger Mortimer, an exiled baron who had once been one of England's most powerful nobles, before Hugh had him imprisoned and stripped of everything. He had escaped the Tower of London with nothing but a name and rage. He was charismatic, calculated, and utterly consumed by the idea of vengeance. Together, Isabella and Mortimer formed a bond that would shake the foundations of monarchy. Some called it love. Others called it strategy. But what it became was rebellion incarnate. Two betrayed aristocrats forging a dagger beneath the skin of England's throne. They made a plan, not to petition, not to plead, but to invade, to return not with letters, but with fire. And in September of 1326, they did exactly that. With just a small force of mercenaries, Isabella and Mortimer landed on English soil, not as diplomats, but as liberators. And what happened next? No historian ever expected. Years of Despenser tyranny had built up like kindling, and now Isabella was the spark. Barons who once cowered under Hugh's shadow raised their banners, castles opened their gates. The people, starved and furious, poured into the streets. This wasn't a rebellion, this was a reckoning. And somewhere in the West, Hugh Despenser was running, not like a lord, but like a hunted man. Power rarely dies in a single stroke. It decays, it flees, it begs. When Isabella and Mortimer crossed into England, Hugh Despenser laughed for a moment. But it didn't take long before that laughter turned into panic. Because what they didn't count on, what no tyrant ever counts on, is that fear has an expiration date. When the tide turned, it didn't trickle, it flooded. Nobles switched allegiance. Garrisons mutinied. Towns closed their gates. The invincible facade cracked and crumbled. King Edward II, once the sovereign ruler of a kingdom, found himself reduced to a fugitive. Not in a foreign land, not behind enemy lines, in his own country. He and Hugh Despenser fled west with the royal treasury, trying to reach the safety of Wales. They moved like ghosts, slipping through forests, hiding in abbeys, dragging gold they could no longer spend. But this wasn't escape. This was delay. The net tightened. Hugh's father, the elder Despenser, was caught first at Bristol. A man once decorated in royal favor, he was hanged while still in armor, then butchered, his body quartered and displayed like rotting signposts of the regime's fall. It was brutal, swift, but what awaited Hugh the Younger would make even seasoned executioners pause. Because Hugh had become more than a criminal, more than a traitor. He had become a symbol, the living embodiment of everything the people believed had poisoned the kingdom. Greed, perversion, manipulation. And when symbols fall, they don't get buried. They get sacrificed. In November of 1326, Edward and Hugh were captured near Neath, exhausted, cornered, and betrayed. There would be no trial in the modern sense. No impartial judge. No slow deliberation. His fate had already been decided, not in a court, but in whispers, knives, and sermons. Dragged to Hereford, Hugh Despenser was starved in his cell for days, not out of cruelty, out of design. They wanted him weak, wanting. They wanted the crowd to see not a man, but ruin. And when he emerged, emaciated and shaking, the people didn't gasp. They cheered. Centuries of anger, fear, and silence had been bottled up, and Hugh Despenser was the cork. Now, they were ready to uncork hell. The morning of Hugh Despenser's execution wasn't just cold. It was holy. Not in the way of prayers or peace, but in the medieval sense, a ritual sacrifice sanctioned by crown, crowd, and clergy alike. November 24th, 1326, Hereford Marketplace. The wooden platform had been built days earlier, high and wide, not for efficiency, but visibility. Every angle calculated, every stage designed, not for punishment, but for performance. They weren't killing a man, they were sending a message. The crowd surged early. Priests, peasants, soldiers, nobles. They came not for tied to a tall ladder. His hands bound behind his back, they crowned him. Not with gold, but with nettles. Thorns pressed into his skull. A parody of royalty. A joke only pain could explain. Then, the scribes came. Yes, scribes. They painted his flesh with biblical passages. Condemnations of pride, corruption, and unnatural sin. Verses not meant to save his soul, but to mark him. To turn his skin into a sermon. This wasn't execution. This was exorcism. And then, the blade. Chroniclers record that the first act of mutilation was precise, cold, measured. His genitals were cut off and thrown into a fire before his eyes. Why? Because rumor had named him the king's lover. His sin wasn't just betrayal. It was blasphemy, a crime against divine order. The fire wasn't just to burn flesh. It was to burn the idea. The crowd roared. Not in horror, in hunger. They had waited years to see fear on this man's face, to make him feel what they had felt. And now they were feeding. Still alive, his abdomen was opened. Slowly, his intestines were pulled from his body, yard by yard, and cast into the flames. One chronicler said his screams didn't sound human, that they echoed like a curse through the crowd. And yet, no one looked away, because this was cleansing. They weren't just killing Hugh Despenser. They were purifying the realm. They didn't hang him until the very end, not because they wanted mercy, but because they wanted maximum impact. Hanging was the finale, not the sentence. When Hugh Despenser finally choked on the rope, he wasn't a man anymore. He was a relic, a symbol, a mutilated blueprint of what happens when someone climbs too close to the sun without permission. But they weren't finished. His body was cut down, stripped, decapitated, and then quartered. His limbs sawn from the torso with brutal precision, not for disposal, for distribution. Each part, arm, leg, chunk of torso, was sent to a different corner of England. Why? Because they weren't trying to erase him. They were trying to immortalize him. Dot. Each mutilated fragment became a warning nailed to the gates of the realm. Dover, York, Bristol, Newcastle. Every city that received a piece of Hugh wasn't just receiving justice. They were receiving instruction. This is what happens when someone takes power not given by blood, law, or God, but by seduction, greed, and influence. His head, the seat of thought, of ambition, of sin, was placed on a spike over London Bridge, the same entrance to the capital through which he had once passed triumphantly, surrounded by guards, banners, and praise. Now, he watched the city he had ruled in silence. This wasn't punishment. This was narrative control, and it worked. For years, decades, children were warned not to whisper treason, lest they end up like the Despensers. Nobles who gathered too close to the monarch's ear were eyed with suspicion. Every favorite, every confidant, every soft-spoken advisor now carried Hugh's shadow on their back. He had become a myth, a cautionary tale. But here's the part no one talks about. They needed Hugh to be a monster, even if he wasn't one. They needed the brutality to feel earned. They needed the spectacle to be remembered, not as cruelty, but as necessity. Because if the execution was too much, If it revealed more about the fear of the crowd than the crime of the man, then maybe the kingdom wasn't purging corruption. Maybe it was hiding it. And Hugh, screaming, boning, broken, was the scapegoat they burned to keep the rot underground. When the screams stopped and the ash cooled, England wasn't clean. It was quiet, but not clean, because while Hugh Despenser's corpse lay scattered across the realm, the man he had served, King Edward II, still breathed. And in the eyes of the new regime, that was unacceptable. You see, executions like Hugh's aren't just about blood. They're about hierarchy. They're about erasing an idea from the collective mind, burning not just a body, but a bond. And Edward II was a living reminder of that bond. The king who had loved, or been manipulated, or both, by a man the world now called a demon. That was dangerous. That was destabilizing. As long as Edward lived, so did the memory of what he allowed, what he enabled. And so they caged him. Berkeley Castle. Cold, remote, and steeped in silence. They didn't torture him, not in the open. No spectacle this time. No stage. Just stone walls, shadows, and silence. But silence is a weapon, too. For nearly a year, Edward was kept out of sight, out of mind, stripped of crown, status, and allies. A ghost wearing royal skin. But ghosts are unpredictable. They linger. They inspire. And whispers of rescue began to spread. Among loyalists, among foreign courts, even among nobles who hated Mortimer and Queen Isabella's new grip on power. So a decision was made. And if the most infamous chroniclers are to be believed, that decision was horrifying. September 1327. In the dark of night, they came. Not with blades or poison. That would leave wounds. That would leave questions. No, they came with a red-hot poker. A weapon of symbolism, not speed. Forced down, screaming into cloth, Edward was violated in the most grotesque and calculated way imaginable. Burned from within. No blood, no gashes, just smoke, silence, and charred insides. His screams were muffled. His scars were invisible. But the message, the same method they used to mock Hugh, they now used to erase Edward. A final, symbolic vengeance for their rumored love, painted as justice, sanctified by silence. No trial, no honor, just a king who died not because he ruled poorly, but because he trusted the wrong man. And in that twisted ending, one thing became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't justice. This was ritual. They thought it was over. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer stood triumphant. The king dethroned. The lover destroyed. The enemies vanquished. The crowd fed. They had won. But history, real history, doesn't reward winners. It tests them. And now, it was their turn in the crucible. At first, it seemed perfect. Mortimer was elevated to the ear of power, whispering into the new boy king's head, just like Hugh had done. Isabella was now Queen Mother, commanding respect, wealth, and vengeance with a single look. They lived in splendor, dressed in gold, surrounded by yes-men and fear. But splendor, he hoarded land. He bypassed the council. He punished rivals in secret. The same things that made Hugh Despenser a villain now echoed through Mortimer's rule like a curse, resurrected. And the queen, the woman once painted as a savior, now called the she-wolf. Cold, cunning, dangerous. The boy king, Edward III, was 17. Smart, silent, watching. And he had learned something from his father's fall. Power must be held, not borrowed, not shared. He saw what Mortimer was becoming, and he hated it. In October 1330, young Edward made his move. A coup, executed not with an army, but with precision. The new king ruled alone, but not before he looked into the mirror of history and saw what happens when you allow favorites, lovers, and shadows to rule in your name. He had learned, and the lesson was carved in blood. Do not share your crown, not with love, not with lust, not with whispers, and not with ghosts. You'd think that after the screams, the flames, and the fall of a king, Hugh Despenser would fade into the ashes. But he didn't. Because the most dangerous men in history aren't always the ones who win. They're the ones who haunt. And Hugh, mutilated, disgraced, scattered, haunted England. For centuries, he became a whisper in the corridors of power, a warning behind every royal curtain. His name was etched into the nightmares of nobles, clergymen, and kings alike. Not just for what he did, but for what he represented. Too much closeness to the throne, too much influence without lineage, too much love, or something darker that could bend a monarch's will. He wasn't just remembered as corrupt. He was remembered as seductive. That word lingered in every retelling, whether they meant politically, emotionally, or sexually. Plays, poems, and later historical dramas resurrected Hugh as the archetype. The beautiful manipulator, the dangerous whisperer, the man who didn't need armies to rule a kingdom, just a vulnerable king and an open door. And let's not lie to ourselves, that story grips people. Why? Because it's not just about history, it's about control. Hugh became the embodiment of a fear older than any monarchy. The fear that those closest to us might rule us, that love could dethrone order, that intimacy could rewrite the law, that a smile behind the curtain might wield more power than a sword. To the patriarchy, he was treason. To the church, he was heresy. To the court, he was contagion. And that's what makes his legacy so potent. Because while other villains were buried in history books, Hugh became a pattern, a shape in the fog, a type of man who still makes the powerful nervous. The charismatic outsider, the confidant who doesn't wait to be given power. He takes it quietly. And the execution, the torture, the mutilation. It didn't bury that fear. It amplified it. Because it wasn't just punishment. It was a public spell. meant to exorcise his memory. But they failed. Because 700 years later, we're still talking about him. Still drawn to the fire they thought would silence him. Still asking, what if the villain wasn't who they told us it was? They told you history is safe, neatly packaged, sanitized, and sold. But truths like these aren't safe. They lurk in the margins, in whispers, in nightmares. Hugh Despenser didn't die because he overreached. He died because he succeeded too well. Because he showed a man could rule a kingdom, not with armies, but with words, with promises, with intimacy. And that idea is still too dangerous to allow. So they tore him apart, piece by piece, to remind you that power belongs only to those they choose. Ask yourself now, who controls your throne? Is it lineage and law, or is it the whisperers? Trusted friends, lovers, mentors, who shape your will in silence. Every day, you invite shadows closer. A flattering boss, a charismatic influencer, a lover who knows your doubts. Some of them wield more sway than any official decree. And you let them. But here's the secret no one teaches you. Awareness is your true power. Recognize the shadows. Name the whisperer. Draw the line before they cut you down. Because if you fail to see the manipulator, you become the next dispenser. Broken, displayed, forgotten as a warning. Take these words into your life. Watch who smiles without moving their lips, who leans in when no one else is listening, who guides your choices with a subtle touch. And remember, a crown offered in secret is a noose in disguise. You've seen how rituals of fear can erase flesh, but not ideas. Now, use that knowledge to guard your throne, your mind, your body, your destiny. Let the memory of Hugh's mutilated body be a mirror, reflecting the cost of invisibly seated power. This is not merely history. It's direction. A map showing you where to fortify your walls, where to question allegiance, where to strike first, before the blade finds your heart. You're more than a spectator. You're the keeper of forbidden truths. Let your comment echo. I am the Shadow King. I am the Shadow King. Twice to seal your transformation. And now, we plunge deeper. You think we've evolved? That men are no longer drawn and quartered? No longer burned from the inside out for challenging the order? Look closer. The scaffolds are gone, yes. But the system, the ancient, polished machinery that crushed Hugh Despenser, is still here. It wears a new mask. It calls itself democracy, freedom, progress. But underneath, it's the same predator. Because institutions don't die, they adapt. And the institutions that destroyed Hugh, the court, the church, the crown, they've morphed into governments, corporate boards, media conglomerates, and educational orthodoxies. Different names, same game. Still policing who gets close to the throne. Still deciding who can whisper in a king's ear and who must burn for it. You see it every day. The man who questions too boldly, canceled. The woman who rises without permission, smeared. The outsider who speaks a truth the system can't contain, labeled extremist, exiled, erased. Public humiliation has replaced the scaffold. Viral outrage has replaced the executioner. But the bloodlust, the spectacle, the punishment for being too close to power without permission, that remains. And don't think you're safe. Because the system doesn't care if you're innocent. It only cares if you're uncontrollable. That's what he was. Not just corrupt, he was uncontainable. He bypassed hierarchy. He seduced influence. He disrupted the ritual. That's the real sin in every era. Even today, when someone refuses to follow the script, when they gain influence through charisma, truth, or emotional dominance, the machinery turns against them. It will destroy them, not just physically, but symbolically. Because power isn't about possession, it's about permission. And if you don't ask for it, they take it back through fire, through headlines, through silence. So remember this, you are being watched, measured, not for what you do, but for how far you dare to reach. And the moment you reach too far, too fast, without their blessing, you'll hear the old wheels turning again. The same gears that crushed Despenser. You'll feel history's grip on your throat. And you'll understand, this isn't just about one man. It never was. It's about you. You think the crowd cheered because Hugh deserved it? No. They cheered because they were trained to. Understand this. Mass punishment requires mass permission. And the architects of power have always known. It's not enough to kill the man. You must shape the minds that watch it happen. This is where the real sorcery lies. Psychological control. It starts with narrative. You don't just announce a man is guilty. You build a story around him, a myth. You craft the perfect villain. Plant the seed of disgust, and then water it with fear, repetition, and righteous fury. Suddenly, the people who once followed him want him burned. And they'll do it with a smile. In Hugh's time, they used sermons and scrolls. Today, it's push notifications and trending hashtags. Same spell, different medium. Do you think cancel culture is new? It's not. It's medieval execution, repackaged. A digital hanging, a social quartering, designed not to deliver justice. Watch what happens when a man steps outside the lines. Watch how fast the wolves gather. Watch how silence becomes safety, and how truth becomes danger. And it works, not because of force, but because of conditioning. You've been trained to flinch when someone speaks too freely, to distrust the man who doesn't apologize, to fear your own voice when it trembles too close to power. This is designed. From the architecture of your education to the cadence of your media, Your mind has been mapped, not to liberate you, but to contain you, just like they contained Despenser. They said he was dangerous, perverse, unnatural, and you believed it because everyone else did. That's how it works. Isolation, reputation, ritual destruction, and then silence. They don't erase you with swords anymore. They erase you by making you unmentionable, invisible, unreal. So ask yourself now, who are they turning you against? Who are they grooming you to burn next? And when the next execution begins, will you cheer or will you see? Because if you see, truly see, you're no longer just a spectator. You become a threat, a mirror, a break in the spell. And that's when things get dangerous. You've been taught that corruption is a glitch in the system. But what if it's the design? The fall of Hugh Despenser didn't end corruption. It repackaged it. When you understand what truly happened, you stop asking who's corrupt and start asking who's in control of the narrative. Because history isn't written by the victors. It's written by the survivors of the purge. And they always make themselves look clean. After Hugh was executed, the people who took power, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, claimed to be saviors, reformers, justice bringers. But in truth, they became everything Hugh was accused of. They ruled with greed. They ruled with secrecy. They ruled through seduction and manipulation of a young king. Mortimer even styled himself the new Despenser in private letters. Let that sink in. They didn't hate Hugh because of what he did. They hated him because he did it first. This is the eternal loop of power. Those who accuse often crave the very sins they condemn. And the institutions that judge them, the court, the church, the state, don't eliminate corruption. They concentrate it. Because that's how control works. It demands a scapegoat, a sacrifice, someone to bleed publicly so the rest can believe the system still works. But behind the ritual, behind the spectacle, the rot deepens. Look at today's global powers. Look at the international institutions you're told are benevolent, neutral, trustworthy. The World Bank, the UN, the IMF, global tech giants, educational monopolies. Do you think these empires function on purity? No. They function like courts of medieval kings. Selective memory, public trials, private deals. The same noble families that crushed Despenser now sit in Davos and Geneva. Different robes, same dynasties. And the mechanisms they more polished, but not less deadly. And here's the cruelest part. They don't even have to kill you anymore. They can just deny you access, lock you out of the algorithm, out of the economy, out of the narrative. You vanish, not in fire, but in silence. Because the new executioner isn't a man with a blade. It's a system with a smile. And every time you trade discomfort for convenience, every time you choose silence over conflict, every time you ignore the shadow behind the throne, you feed it, you serve it, you become it. you've been told loyalty is a virtue. That to be loyal is to be good. That it's noble to serve something greater than yourself. But what if I told you that's how they trap you? Loyalty, when misdirected, is not a virtue. It's a shackle. Hugh Despenser's entire rise was built on loyalty. His loyalty to King Edward II. He gave the king everything: his cunning, his influence, his soul. He became the royal chamberlain, the gatekeeper, the whisperer behind the throne. Not just a servant, a believer. But that's what made him dangerous. Because in every system of power, loyalty isn't rewarded unless it serves the hierarchy. The moment your loyalty bends the shape of that hierarchy, when it empowers someone not approved by the order, it becomes treason. Hugh didn't betray the crown. He served it too well. And for that, he was destroyed. Understand this. Every regime, every empire, every institution, from the medieval court to your modern job, your nation, your algorithm, demands loyalty. But not to you, not to truth, to itself, to the structure. And if you ever pledge your loyalty without questioning what you're serving, you've already lost. Because they will feed off it. They will use your devotion to justify atrocities, to build prisons around your identity, to convince you to sacrifice freedom, friendship, even your own thoughts for a cause they've constructed. Ask any soldier who was used, any worker who was discarded, any follower who was cast aside once their usefulness ran dry. Loyalty becomes betrayal the moment it no longer serves their agenda. That's what happened to Despenser, and that's what's happening now to millions. People pledging themselves to political parties that don't care about them, to corporations that trade them for quarterly gains, to ideologies that devour dissent and spit out obedience. And they reward you for it. They hand out digital trophies, performance bonuses, good citizen badges, until the moment you step out of line. Then, the same system that praised you becomes your executioner. Because loyalty to them was never love. It was leverage. So I'll ask you now, what are you loyal to? And is it loyal to you? Because if it isn't, you may already be standing on your own scaffold. Do you really think public shame disappeared with the stocks and scaffolds? No. It evolved. It put on a suit. It built a digital profile. It learned your habits, your fears, your impulses, and it became invisible. But make no mistake, ritual humiliation is still the blood sacrifice of empire. In Hugh Despenser's time, they dragged his body through the streets, crowned him with thorns, etched scripture into his skin, burned his genitals in front of a roaring crowd. Why? Because pain alone wasn't enough. They needed to make him less than human. They needed the masses not just to witness his fall, but to enjoy it. And today, the rituals are cleaner, more civilized, but the intent is the same. You get exposed. You trend for the wrong reasons. you become a lesson. Watch what happens when a man steps outside the approved script, when he says what's forbidden, when he loves the wrong person, when he refuses to bend the knee. They don't debate him. They dehumanize him. They dig through his past, strip his context, reduce him to one quote, one moment, one label: racist, traitor, extremist, freak. Then they drag him through the square. Not a medieval town, but your feed, your timeline, your group chat. And just like the screaming mob in 1326, people cheer. Not because they know the truth, but because they've been trained to obey the ritual. Humiliation has become currency, a tool to remind you, don't get too bold, don't speak too loud, don't challenge the priesthood, whether it wears robes, lab coats, badges, or blue check marks, because the ritual is always watching, and it demands blood. But here's the secret they fear most. The ritual only works when you fear shame more than you fear chains. When you let them define who you are. And that's why this matters. Because when you recognize the pattern, when you see the ritual for what it is, you become untouchable. You step outside the program, and they can't control what they can't humiliate. So to everyone still watching, still awake, still listening, write this in the comments now. I will not kneel. Write it twice. Once for them, and once for the man you're becoming. Because once you break free from their shame, you don't just survive, you return fire. They don't need to burn your books anymore. They just rewrite the code. Because the final prison isn't built with chains or fire. It's built with memory. You see, when they executed Hugh Despenser, they didn't just want him dead. They wanted him erased. Not forgotten, but rewritten. In the years after his death, chroniclers, funded by the new regime, re-described him as a monster, a pervert, a disease on the kingdom. They flooded manuscripts with tales of his wickedness, his supposed lust for the king, his greed, his cruelty. The goal wasn't justice, it was narrative control. Because if they controlled the story of who Hugh was, they could control how their rule was remembered. This is the dark secret of every empire. History is not a record of truth. It's a weapon. And those who hold the pen decide who were heroes and who were demons. Now ask yourself, how many times have you believed something just because it was repeated in a textbook, in a documentary, on a glowing screen? How many times have you swallowed the version of history that was safest for those in power? They've taught you to trust the narrative, but not your own eyes. They've taught you to worship the curated memory and ignore the whispers in the margins. But those whispers, that's where the real history lives. They told you the Crusades were about religion, never about gold, spice, and control. They told you colonization was civilization, not theft written in blood. They told you modern wars are fought for freedom, never for profit, pipelines, and patents. Just like they told you Despenser died for treason, not because he got too close to the truth. This is memory warfare. And you've been its casualty since birth. The neat villains, the simplified timelines. Because truth doesn't come in a press release. It comes covered in ash, blood, and contradiction. And it waits for the few brave enough to dig for it. They rewrote Hugh's memory to protect their future. Now ask yourself, who's rewriting yours? What parts of your past have been censored? What memories are being deleted every time you click agree, accept, submit? You want power? Then stop asking for the story and start rewriting your own. Signed, to walk before you print any notes you don't have. This is your final descent. The point of no return. Because after this, you won't look at history the same way again. And you won't look at yourself the same either. Hugh Despenser was never meant to be remembered. He was meant to be erased. His story dissolved in fear. His name reduced to a warning. But here you are, still listening, still watching, still following the blood trail through the shadows of the past. You didn't come here for entertainment. You came because something in you knows. Something is off. Something beneath the surface is and here's the part they never want you to know. You were never just a spectator. You were a potential disruptor. Every man who steps outside the script, who questions the ritual, who reclaims his mind, is a threat. Because one awakened man can't be manipulated. One awakened man can't be humiliated. One awakened man becomes legend. The same blood that ran through emperors, rebels, kings, heretics, and visionaries runs through you. The only difference between you and them, is whether you answer the call. You felt it, that itch behind your eyes, that sense that the world is lying to you, that what you were taught is off, that you were born for more than obedience and paycheck chains. That's not madness. That's the beginning of remembering who you are. So here's your final instruction. Don't just watch this video. Don't just think about Hugh Despenser. Don't just comment a phrase and disappear. Start the rebellion. In your habits, in your thoughts, in how you speak, in what you will no longer accept. Don't wait for the mob to choose your side. Stand before they arrive. Because history doesn't just repeat, it recruits. And now it's knocking on your door. What will you become? A spectator in the square, or the fire they can't contain? Make your choice. The next chapter begins now.